Welcome back, guys. Today we are going to be going over PR7. It released today. However, you guys are probably going to see this video this weekend when I have time to actually edit it, which still should be before anyone has the ability to obtain one of these ships, as the minimum required time to get one is 7 days. Much better than my lead time for PR6. If you want to watch my PR6 review, that just came out today as well. About time, am I right? All right, let's get right into it. Really quickly, first things first, 2 Augment Modules, Lebzeg and Centaur. Both of them are actually pretty good, and Centaur's is actually very good. It gives her an extra 10% damage boost plus extra stats and a reload buff, which is going to make her launch at faster times. So Centaur actually getting usable again, thanks to that. Now with that out of the way, let's get into PR7. Now I want to talk about gear first, because I think there's a chance that looking at gear is going to be important before we go talk about the ships. And let's start with the UR Rainbow Plane, the LA-9. This is a fighter, the first rainbow fighter in the game. It's a Russian fighter, so it's supposed to go with the new Russian carrier. However, it also is going to work with Kearsarge. Being a Russian fighter means you can actually put it on Kearsarge and get the buff she needs. It's also a rocket fighter, so it's in that new realm of these fighters getting really buffed. Not only does it have the highest aviation stat of any fighter, but it's also going to have the highest damage of any of the rockets, basically. And then it's geared towards, when you look at the armor modifiers, medium and heavy armor. So it completely is the best in slot fighter plane against medium armor, and it actually overtakes probably any of the bombers which you were using for the heavy armor. For example, the Pancake was frequently used. This is going to take both of those out. It's going to be the best in slot. Now, I don't think it's actually going to be better on light armor. The HVAR rockets are still better in that system due to there. So is your fighters going, you have the HVAR now rockets, which are for light armor, and this plane is going to be used for pretty much everything else. The only downside here being rockets is that you are going to maybe miss out on some of the interceptor value and crash damage. However, you're not really missing out on a whole lot of crash damage, and obviously that's only for PvP, and carriers aren't really in PvP anymore, but I am interested to see how that works out. I do think that outside of a hard ACV value, you're not really going to need the interceptors as much. You obviously want interceptors when you're running like your third, carrier fleet for like World 15 or something like that. But for the most part, I think this is going to be your equip for everything mostly, unless it's a light armor boss, and then you're going to be wanting to go with the HVARs. Theoretically, there are some downsides here. Its cooldown is a little bit higher than some of the other rocket planes, so if for some reason you're launching and you can get an extra airstrike in a battle, you might want to switch it out. Additionally, it is single target priority, so if you are in a situation where you want AoE damage, you might still want to go with some bombs. But outside of that, this plane is a best in slot against medium armor bosses and heavy armor bosses. You got to pick up a bunch of these. Ideally, you're going to be shooting for like probably 6, maybe 5 or 4. It's going to take you a long time to get, though, so this is what you're going to be working on for quite a while. We can finally have a full rainbow plane loadout, though, so that's kind of exciting. All right, sticking with the planes, let's talk about the VIT-2, which is an SR Russian torpedo bomber. These are actually converging torpedoes, so that's kind of exciting. We get to compare it with the other converging torpedoes like the Ryusei or the Ju-87. It has a lower cooldown than those, so it is slower, and you might have to change them out depending on what your composition works with, but it has 4 torpedoes. Now the damage is less, that makes sense, but when you combine the 4 torpedoes hitting off of this plane with the 3 that would hit on the other plane, the total max damage that this plane can do is the highest in the game of any of the converging torpedoes. Of course, they have to all hit, so that's a chance you are taking by them missing. However, they are converging torpedoes, so if they are going to hit, they're more likely than any of the other ones. Again, single target heavy armor bosses that you typically use converging torpedoes for, this is going to be best in slot. Really, the only situation where you would use one of the older converging torpedo planes is in a specific boss fight where the reduced cooldown of those other planes can let you get an extra airstrike off. Needless to say, that will happen, but it won't happen that often, so it's probably pretty safe to just slap these on all of your carriers that need converging torpedoes. Did I mention this has the highest crash damage of any plane in the game? Maybe if carriers ever make a comeback into PvP, this will see some play. Although Although because of Laffy 2, you probably still will want to use the Spearfish. Converging torpedoes against a fast-moving light armor enemy is not very good. Giving up a little crash damage for some rockets is probably worth it. Anyway, you're going to want a bunch of these because when you do have a heavy armor boss that doesn't move, you're going to want to slap these all over all of your carriers in PvE. So this is another basically best in slot, minus some timing issues for some very specific fights. All right, let's continue on with the third plane of this research season, the SR seaplane. Seaplanes are notoriously bad, and you're only using them on ships that require them to equip a seaplane, like some destroyers or some aviation battleships. But typically, if you have the option to not equip a seaplane, you probably aren't equipping it. That being said, this F8F Bearcat seaplane is actually pretty decent as far as seaplanes go. So I think this is probably going to be best in slot for basically anything that needs to require a seaplane. It seems to be tiered a little bit more towards the heavy armor with those tiny Tims, but finally a seaplane that's not completely terrible. In fact, its skill looks amazing. When equipped by a destroyer, it launches 3 additional prototype seaplanes on the airstrike. So this is going to be very important for probably the new US destroyer that has rumored to have a seaplane slot. This looks like it has Halford written all over it. All right, 3 planes and 3 best in slot equipment. We're already doing much better than PR5 and PR6 in terms of equipment. All right, let's move into the SR battleship gun, the twin 410mm, aka the Daisen gun. Now, I'm really excited about this gun because of the potential to be used with Musashi. Musashi, as you know, is locked to IJN guns if you want to get her enhanced barrage, which you always do. Now, being a SR, it actually has 45 firepower, which is better than the barrage guns you're using on her now, whether you're using the rare for the really short cooldown or the elite for the, medium cooldown. It also is an AP shell, so it's more geared towards medium and heavy armor, whereas the other ones are geared towards light armor, so that gives us some options to swap out against our enemy type. Theoretically, the AP is also really nice for PvP, where you have a lot of heavy armor enemies in the backline. But man, that damage is not good. 2 shots at 156 is basically equivalent to a purple gun that was also not very good. Now, it does have a higher damage coefficient, so it's going to deal slightly more damage, but that purple gun is actually used for its cooldown reduction, and this is a slow gun. Like 22.6 seconds is pretty slow, especially considering it is firing only 2 shots. Now, if it was firing 3 shots, I could totally live with that, but at 2 shots, 22.6 seconds for its firing rate is too slow. A lot of people are going to just stick with the purple gun, and if you're in PvP, you're probably going to just go with full cooldown reduction and go to the blue gun. So I don't see it making a wave in PvP, so that's a little disappointing for me. And then when we get to PvE, where we care about damage, you can just upgrade to the triple version, and the triple 410 is going to be like 1.5 seconds slower, but it's going to do massive amounts of damage. So because of that, once again, we're in this field where it is technically faster, so in a specific situation, you might run it to get an extra shot out, but otherwise, in PvE, you're going to go to the triple 410 so you can get more damage per shot, and in PvP, you're going to go to like the twin 410mm for HE or whatever, or maybe even the blue one, depending on, your preference, to get the faster barrages. So this is kind of in the middle of no man's land, where it's not best in slot for either of them. This gun is kind of disappointing, but we were due for one because all 3 of those planes were busted. All right, let's move on to the next gun, the 254mm model 1939 CA gun. This is a gun probably meant for Napoli. And honestly, 2023 was the year of the heavy cruiser gun. We got 3 UR heavy cruiser guns last year that were all very good. And this gun by no means stands up to any of those. So if you have those guns, you're probably going to prefer them. This gun's a little bit too slow for me to get excited about it. But if you're looking for something because you're a newer player to bide your time until you get some of the better heavy cruiser guns, this is a good place to start off. If you are focusing on PR7 research, this shouldn't be too difficult to make, and it will carry you enough to get through a decent amount of content until you can get some of the better guns in this category. The only other thing to note is that it is an Italian gun that's not SAP, so the only Italian heavy cruiser gun was an SAP ammo focused strictly on medium armor. This gun is a little bit more well-rounded, so if for some reason you have a ship that is locked to an Italian gun, this gives you another option. I anticipate this gun will be for new players only and forgotten about in the long list of heavy cruiser guns that we have. All right, the final equipment equipment we're going to be looking at is the 152mm Model 1936 CL gun. This looks like it's meant to go on Napoli as well. And I had to actually look this up, but this is the first SAP ammo light cruiser gun, which would be pretty exciting because it can now specialize in medium armor if it weren't such a trash gun. Obviously, if you have Plymouth guns, they are leagues better than this gun. This gun barely competes with many of the other SR CL guns in the game that have been around for a long time, and it really only competes at medium armor. This is very much a collection-only gun that you can probably ignore unless Napoli requires it for some reason. And for her sake, I hope she doesn't have any restrictions on these Italian guns, because that will be bad. All right, that is all the equipment's out of the way, so let's get into the ships now that we have some context about what equipment is coming with them. I'm going to start out with Napoli because we were talking about her for the equipment and potentially using it. Additionally, she is the ship I'm most excited about and will probably be the one that I start regardless of this review. Unless, of course, there's a PR ship that completely changes the PvP meta, then we do that one first and then come back to Napoli. First thing that stands out is that massive HP pool. It is the highest of any heavy cruiser in the game by quite a bit, actually. In fact, she might as well seem like a large cruiser. Now, it doesn't seem that oppressive because if we're comparing her against large cruisers, it's kind of on par with the other Rainbow Rarity large cruisers. But remember, she's a heavy cruiser. Additionally, she is base heavy armor, so she doesn't need to equip anything special to get that extra boost. That can be a downside, though, if you're running against torpedoes or something that does extra damage to heavy armor, but generally in PvE content, heavy armor is going to help you tank more. Her evasion isn't bad. It's kind of standard of the pack. It's around where Drake was when she came out, which is, you know, not amazing, but not awful either. When we look at her damage potential, I don't see a lot of great things here. She has lower firepower and torpedo stat than Drake, a ship that came out many years ago, doesn't see any play, and she's lower than that. So I think stat-wise, it's decently safe to say that she's going to be more geared towards tanking unless something in the skills changes that. Also, can we just talk about her weird gun setup? Hindenburg, which got a main gun +2 or 3 main gun shots, a ghost gun, and kept her torpedoes, was amazing. They did something weird here where they gave her 2 light cruiser auxiliary shots and then gave her 1 main gun and kept her torpedoes. This is weird, especially given that her light cruiser gun slot has like 70% efficiency. That seems very low. So I think she definitely is going to be geared towards being a tank because I don't really like the way that this gun setup is currently situated. I guess this makes sense more that the research gear had a light cruiser gun and a heavy cruiser gun for her because she has both slots, and obviously having the main gun +1 on the auxiliary slot is kind of weird, but we'll see what the skills read. Skill number 1, she gains a special secondary gun that fires every second. Okay, so she gets a ghost gun. It's an auxiliary gun again, so she's going to be the queen of auxiliary guns. I don't know what that means. I mean, I guess it'll mean that she fires faster than what you would for heavy cruisers that have main guns. Additionally, she gets a plus 10% boost to her firepower and evasion stats. We like evasion stats. We like firepower stats. Great, cool. If there are any enemies within 40 range of her, her main gun, secondary gun, and special secondary gun will all ignore shields. Great, that's what Hindenburg does. That is good. She gets to do that as well, except that she has to be within range, so it's just a handicap version of Hindenburg's skill, but still very good. We like ignoring guns. 40 range is not terrible, but it will come up because a lot of the guns she's equipping is going to have like, 60 or 70 range, so she does have to get close for her to ignore shields, whereas Hindenburg just always ignores shields. Skill number 2, at the start of battle and every 20 seconds afterward, she deploys a smoke screen that lasts for 5 seconds, and everyone in that smoke screen gets 40% evasion rate. So she gets a smoke screen. It starts at the start of the battle, so that's really nice. That's going to help with her tankiness. She really looks at her stat wise like she's supposed to be a tank. This is really going to help, especially since evasion was where she's lacking. She had the armor type, she had the HP. Now she gets the evasion rate. That's great. She has a decent evasion stat, especially when you consider her first skill that has the evasion stat buff. Now she gets the evasion rate that goes and stacks on top of that. So she's going to be pretty tanky inside that smoke screen. Additionally, after that smoke screen is deployed, she fires every half a second for 5 seconds another fueled smoke screen that lasts 1 second. It affects only her, and it gives her a guaranteed basically 40% evasion rate, and her secondary gun efficiency goes up 100%. It doesn't affect her special secondary, but it does mean her secondary gun that has a main gun +1 will have 170% efficiency rate, which is much, much better. Now, the uptime on this is going to be interesting because it's going to be basically for 5 or 6 seconds every 20 seconds, so that's more or less about a third of the the time she's going to be in this up rate where she's going to be super tanky and actually have good damage. And then the other 2/3 of the time, she is going to be a little lackluster. She gets the normal siren boost damage that PR ships do, but let's look at this all-out assault. It triggers every 8 times the main gun is fired. Now, her reload is actually kind of especially bad. It's not good. And normally, when a heavy cruiser has an all-out assault that fires every 8 times, that's because they have a main gun +1, i.e. they are shooting twice every time, so it's really more like 4. When they don't have a main gun +1, they typically have it every 6 times. That's not the case here. She's got a slow reload, she doesn't have her main gun +1, she has it on her auxiliary gun, but this only triggers every time her main gun is fired, so that does not matter. When you tank this out, depending on which gear you're going to be equipping, this might only trigger once a battle, if that at all. Like, we're talking about waiting potentially 40, 50, 60 seconds before she gets an all-out assault. That is like almost criminal for a UR level ship like this that is firepower based. I don't know, it seems like an error to me. It is so laughably bad that her all-out assault, it doesn't even matter how good the all-out assault is, it's just not going to happen. Now, she has a second all-out assault that is a torpedo barrage. Her torpedo stat's not very good though, and that's why her normal torpedo firing, let alone this barrage, is not going to be that much damage, but it does do it every 10 times the special secondary gun is fired. Obviously, this doesn't take into account the main gun +1 for the auxiliary guns at all, because it's only the special gun. So this is going to be firing like every 10 seconds. At least this is a little bit more normal. So interesting. All right, overall, this ship is a little bit more of a disappointment, right? She is totally outclassed by something like a Hindenburg, and she is tanky. She's probably the tankiest ship in the game in the Vanguard. I would say that she's probably more tanky than a gear, and that's what you would be using her for. But tankiness is not necessarily what you want in PvE. And in PvP, the way that she is heavy armor and the smoke screen and stuff, she's just not going to be useful in PvP, where tankiness might be useful because she's just too slow, she's heavy armor, and you'd rather just have like Laffy. In fact, Anchorage is probably a preferred tankiness slot for me over her, just because you can time her smoke screen better. Her smoke screen gives her invincibility, her smoke screen gives her a shield. This one has a much worse smokescreen that's more focused on offensive capacity, but at the same time, she has so much less offensive capacity than all of the other like DPS focused heavy cruisers. And on top of that, I would say that in a lot of situations where she might be useful, Breast might be more useful due to the heal. Now that's more for AoE, and this could be against mobbing a really powerful boss. So I would say she's the tankiest ship in the game for a, Vanguard ship, but I don't see her seeing a lot of play because her reduction in damage I don't think warrants that tankiness. I think for mobbing you'd rather have a healer like Breast. I think for damage you'd rather have Hindenburg, and if you are in PvP you'd rather have something that you can tailor more to your specific needs like Anchorage. So I think she kind of sits in this slot of being a tank master that really doesn't have a slot. Like, she really kind of reminds me of Prince Eugen, where they're like, here's the best tank ever that you will almost never use. I mean, theoretically, maybe an EX challenge where, she could be useful, but then again, evasion rate doesn't matter in EX challenges because they have 100% hit rate. So you're really just relying on her heavy armor and her massive health pool, but you could do that with like a large cruiser. She's also not very fast, so if you are, trying to manually dodge the bullets, she'll be a hindrance there. So I don't even know there. Now I'm talking myself out of it there. So I don't know. Napoli, a little bit of a disappointment. I'm still going to probably do a first unless there's something that screams PvP that I need to do. But okay, this ship a little bit disappointing, but still interesting. She will be very tanky, and I'm going to try and use her in some late game content. All right, I talked about Napoli for a while because I was very excited about her, but let's move on to the other DR we have in PR7, and that is the Russian aircraft carrier Admiral Nakhimov. I think that's how it's pronounced. And man, do her stats look pretty good. She has the highest aviation stat of any ship in the game. Previously, that title was held by Hercuryu, and she surpasses Hercuryu in terms of aviation stat. She also has the highest HP pool of any carrier in the game too. She is the first carrier to break the 9,000 mark. And while Yorktown 2 will keep her title of having the highest reload stat of any of the Rainbow Rarity carriers, Admiral Nakhimov is going to have 2 more reload stat over the traditional meta damage dealing carriers like Shinano, Hercuryu, Implacable. So she's going to have the most HP, the most aviation stat, and more reload than most of the other carriers in her tier. And oh my gosh, I just got to the efficiencies. Let's look at this loadout. She has 3 fighters, which is a lot better than it was a couple years ago we just got that LA9 that is purpose built for her, so fighter slots are no longer bad. Her second slot is a flex spot, so depending on what you're doing, you can change that all over the place. And then she has a third slot for torpedo bombers. All of those have 3 plane loadouts, meaning she is a 9 plane carrier, which is not unexpected for a DR like her, but is really good. That's the most amount of planes that any carrier has had in the game so far. She also has 140% efficiency across the board. 140% is kind of the gold standard. You know, something like Shinano has that in her main best slot. She has it across the board. So stat-wise, I think she's the best carrier. Like, just looking at the stats. Now, there are a lot of skills that make some of the other DR and UR carriers really good. So maybe she'll have a bad skill. She's probably not. Her stats are through the roof amazing. I think maybe a little bit overhyped. We'll see what the skills bring, but really, really good here. Her first skill gives her 15% aviation buff across the board. Something like a Shinano is going to require that it be the first 2 battles or that you have 3, IJN ships. This one's just flat, easy. And then it's 15% hit stat, which is something that carriers do lack a lot. So that's really nice. And 20% crit rate. That is amazing. I mean, I don't know how to explain this, but having the ability to just crit like that, the additional hit stat is going to make her miss less. And then the crit rate boost, that's just a raw crit rate boost. That is going to be a ton of criticals. I mean, so far, everything in this ship has been kind of busted. So the crit rate is just amazing. Also, when she launches an airstrike, she launches an additional aerial barrage that applies shock to all the enemies on the field 1.5 seconds later, and it slows them for 60% of their speed for 5 seconds. So she has a slow too. It's not a full freeze there, but it is a slow. It is timed to do well. So they're going to start slowing as the planes are going to arrive rather than slowing immediately, having the planes launch, and then the planes get there and they're going to be starting to speed up again. It's 5 seconds, so that's kind of long. It's a good duration. So she has, I mean, this is everything that you want in your first skill, basically. I mean, if the second skill is a preloaded, she's, the most busted ship I've ever seen. But we got the stats that we want. We got the hit and the criticals, and we got a barrage, and we got a freeze. Okay, great. I mean, it's not a full freeze, but it's good. All right, so first skill, really simple, really good. Let's move on to skill number 2. When this ship launches an airstrike, reduce the enemy's anti-air and evasion by 5%. 5% is not a lot, but that is exactly what we want to do. She launches an airstrike, she's going to debuff you as the planes are coming there. That's actually really nice. That's going to pair really nicely with her hit stat boost from the first skill, because you're not dodging her. Man, she really takes out those evasion tanks, which is something, that carriers do struggle with because of their lower hit stat and things like that. Also, she's going to make the enemy take 5% more damage for 6 seconds. This is really good. It prioritizes elite enemies. This obviously is only a single target, so if you are trying to mob, it's less good, but you're probably not mobbing with this ship. Let's just be realistic. So yeah, it's going to, decrease all of the stats that are relevant against, defending against aviation damage, and then it's just going to be a damage buff for her for the 6 seconds. Also, it's not just for her, it's for all of the other damage that she could take. So in theory, if all of your other carriers or all of your other ships fire or launch within that 6-second period, they're going to get the boost too. Amazing. Great. All right, last one. Enemies slowed by other Russian ships' skills, interesting, are additionally afflicted by flawed for the rest of the fight. If a flawed enemy has shock applied to them, shock is from the first skill, they have their speed set to 0 for 2.5 seconds. Okay, so she does have a freeze. So she basically will have them freeze for 2.5 seconds, and then the remainder of the 2.5 seconds of that 5 seconds is going to be, 60% slow, which is still decent. So she's going to have a hard freeze and then a slow freeze. That's really good. And it's interesting because it actually makes you really want to run Russian ships that have those slow effects. I think the first one that comes to mind off the top of the head is Sovietskaya Soyuz. She looks purpose built for that. Soyuz is obviously going to buff her because she's a carrier. And of course, she has a freeze that should be coming out right around the time when she's launching the airstrike. So I think Soyuz is almost a must put with her. Additionally, you could also use some of the Vanguard ships in the Russian faction that, have a lot of good freezes. I think Pymat is something that comes to mind post retrofit that could be really interesting with this as well. Oh, she gives a 40% crit damage boost to flawed enemies. Okay, so now it's a must. You have to run this with something that has a freeze. Sovietskaya Soyuz seems like a must here. I mean, the freeze is really nice, and obviously Soyuz will buff her kind of, like a faction buffer as well, and obviously gets the airstrike buff, but oh my gosh, 40% crit damage. That's on top of the fact that crit damage already does 1.5 times damage, and on top of the fact that she reduces their evasion, she increases her hit stat, and she increases the raw crit damage rate by 20%. So it's she will be criticaling a lot. And then if you boost 40% on top of that, that's going to be some of I think she's going to have the highest damage of any carrier. I mean, you do need to flaw the enemies, which you can only do by getting them with a slow effect by the Russians, but the Russians specialize in these slow effects, so like it shouldn't be too hard. Chkalov after Fate Simulation +5 has it as well now, and then there's like so bunch of like the Vanguard ships like Talon and things like that have this. I think Paimat and Soyuz are probably the only two that really should be there. Chkalov maybe, since now you can have the whole, Russian backline with Soyuz and the Admiral and Chkalov, but that's not even required because Sovietskaya Soyuz doesn't even require you have Russian carriers, just that you have carriers. So you could swap off Chkalov for like any of the other power carriers like Hakuryu or Shinano. All right, I'm just scared to look at what the third skill is because man, those two first skills are like the best skills that I could have seen for her. I mean, and I'm really interested in them because it does make some interesting ways that you build the fleet, because it's not just like this is the best carrier ever. This is the best carrier if you put the right amount of Northern Parliament ships that can do the slow effects. So I'm very happy with the first two skills. Let's move into the third skill. She gets a boost by 15% to her anti-air stat and her evasion stat. So, boosting survivability, great. She's already pretty tanky. She doesn't have a damage reduction, I noticed, like some of the other ones, so just keep that in mind. Her detection bar regenerates 2 points more per second for 5 seconds every 25 seconds. That's a weird way to say it, but basically she's going to be able to be hidden better. And then when her HP is dropped below 40%, she resets her detection bar and takes 0 damage from burns for 8 seconds. That 0 damage from burns got me very excited for a second because I was like, 0 damage? She goes invincible? Oh my gosh. But it's only from burns. It's only for 8 seconds. This procs once per battle. But she does get to reset her detection bar, which does help with survivability, but it's actually more important because she's going to get her hidden carrier buff back, which is also really unique and interesting. So this skill is certainly less hype than some of the first two skills, but it does add her some survivability, not nearly as good as some of the other carriers, but she doesn't particularly need it because she is going to be a massive carrier. Of course, she has no cooldown reduction, so as with most carriers like this, she's going to be kind of slow, which is all right when you're focusing in PvE, where she is going to live, because carriers in PvP just aren't really part of the meta right now. But I think she is a must pick up. She probably should be your first target in terms of getting her done. She's much better than Napoli. She is going to be essential for certain compositions. Hopefully you have Sovietskaya Soyuz, because if you don't, it might be kind of difficult to get that flawed skill for her, and that's going to be interesting. So she is basically going to be the best carrier in the game, but she's going to have to be paired with a event exclusive Sovietskaya Soyuz. So I'm interested about that. But yeah, definitely pick her up. Even if you don't have her, you can definitely get the flawed like slows with some other ships. I don't think Kronk has a slow, which is a little bit disappointing because having Kronk in your aircraft carrier fleet to do the slowing and then boosting the spread in your other fleet would be kind of cool, but I don't think that happens. But yeah, I don't know. You do have to figure out where you're getting those slows from so that you can flaw the enemy, but this ship is amazing. Awesome. And great design. I like this ship a lot. Also, I just noticed that Admiral Nakhimov and Napoli are both requiring fleet tech and experience from the Italians and the Russians. So that's kind of a cool little synergy between the two of them. Like it's an Italian-Russian PR system here. And if you have either of those factions, those are going to work for both of their requirements for fleet tech as well as for experience gain. All right, let's move on to the PR ships. These are much easier to obtain. They only require 343 blueprints compared to the DRs, which require 513 blueprints that are also more rare to drop. Let's start with the IJN battleship Daisen. Stat-wise, she looks very similar to Nagato, a little bit of a buff. She has higher reload and her main gun efficiency is a little bit higher, but Nagato's a pretty old ship, so having it be a little stronger than Nagato is probably fine, given that Nagato will probably have better skills given that she has a really good buff. But let's look at Daisen here. Skill number 1, she gets 20% boost to her firepower and torpedo stat, which is interesting because she has some damage that scales off her torpedo stat with her barrage. She launches a special barrage every time she fires the main gun, gun, so she's a barrage battleship. This is obviously guaranteed, so that's much nicer than Nagato. However, uniquely, she's going to get different buffs based on the number of barrages it is. So for odd number barrages, she ignites enemies hit with a special burn for 15 seconds, and for even number barrages, she procs an additional torpedo barrage, which is where that torpedo stat comes into play. So that's kind of interesting. She's swapping between the two. And then if you equip a Japanese anti-air gun, she reverses the order. So if you want the torps first, you just put a Japanese anti-air gun on her to kind of switch her, which is really cool because anti-air guns are the least important. So having her gear switch the setup is kind of nice. So I do like that. It's unique. It's interesting. Not saying it's good, but it allows you to swap with whether you want burn or whether you want torpedoes. And that can be depending on the enemy's armor type. If they're heavy armor, go with the torpedoes. If they're light armor, go with the burn. Also, when her HP is below 30%, she gets both of the barrage buffs. So cool. She gets both of them at some point. Hopefully she's never under 30%. That's a little bit low, especially in PvE. She's going to see no play in PvP. So whatever. I mean, that's fine. Cool skill. I like it as far as like being unique. Skill number 2, she launches a scout plane whenever she finishes reloading her gun. So this happens regardless of whether you're firing. And man, this really iterates that she wants a very fast barrage gun on her, which is kind of funny because the equipment we went over is not really that. She launches that plane and it marks the enemy that's furthest away, who would take 20% more damage from Daisen specifically for 10 seconds. So that's interesting, especially for manual players, since it will force you to target the farthest away and also allows you to, it forces you to fire quickly, but it's not going to be much of a difference. It's basically a 20% damage boost against something. If it's against a boss, it will probably be the thing that's farthest away most of the time. Also, if that scout plane is shot down, which is super relevant in some forms of content with all of their anti-air, she's going to heal all the Vanguard for 8%. That's cool, although sometimes you're going to really want that scout plane to die and it's not. I wish you could like have it die on command, but now you're like, oh, I hope they shoot it down so I can heal my Vanguard. But 8% is really good. It's the whole Vanguard, so she has a heal on her, which is cool. If the plane is shot down twice, she heals the current lowest percentage HP Vanguard for 5%. So, and that procs once per battle. So that's also interesting. So she basically, the first time it's shot down, she heals everything 8%, and the second time it's shot down, she heals the lowest percentage Vanguard by 5%. So that's interesting there. And of course, she gets to do the extra damage. So overall, she has a unique kit. It's very interesting. There's a heal, there's a burn, there's a barrage, there's a scout plane, but it's not really going to make her on level with any of the rainbow rarity ships that we have in the current game, but she certainly is interesting. And had this come out, 3 years ago, I'd probably be using her. All right, let's move on to the USS Halford, a destroyer that has a lot of speculation here because the Halford was actually a real ship at one point. However, in the World Warships, which is who this collaboration is with, she had a plane which was not really built. So we anticipate her to have a plane here because obviously these are paper ships. Stat-wise, she reminds me the most of Alan M. Sumner, although notably worse in most areas. She specifically is going to have worse anti-air by a lot, and that 0 luck stat is going to hurt compared to 80. Additionally, Halford has aviation stat though, which is going to tie into the fact that she can launch a plane. When we look at her equipment, she does have the ability to launch a seaplane, which makes a lot of sense given that we saw the seaplane come in the equipment, and that's going to switch out for her anti-air gun, which is fine. That's the one we wanted to switch out, so that's good. The efficiency is not bad on that, and we know the seaplane's going to launch basically 4 seaplanes every time, so that's actually really good. So far, we're looking okay in terms of the seaplane. The stats are, a little disappointing for a PR destroyer. So let's look at skill number 1. If it's equipped with an Eagle Union equipment, which is going to be the seaplane, very easy, the easiest requirement ever, she's going to get 20% aviation boost. Great. So she is getting aviation boost, which is not usually something you see on a destroyer, but whatever. At the start of the battle and every 15 seconds afterwards, she's going to mark an enemy, which reduces its evasion by 10% for 6 seconds. This 15-second mark is kind of interesting because usually for barrages, we want it earlier like this. But with the marking, you might want it slower, especially if you're running with carriers. Carriers aren't really going to be able to get up to that 15 to 21 second mark as easily. Battleships should be able to get there, no problem. But for carriers, that is a little bit harder for them to meet. Also, the start of the battle is like, you're not really going to get a lot of buff unless you have a pre-launch or a pre-salvo. So interesting though, but we are marking them to reduce their evasion only. It doesn't do extra damage or anything like that. Also, she's going to launch her seaplane barrage. And if the enemy is hit hit by the seaplane barrage, the one that's marked, of course, it will take 8% more damage from firepower-based attacks for 6 seconds. So she's very much focused on buffing the battleships, which, kind of goes to the point I was saying as I was mid-sentence there. I probably should have finished reading the whole skill before I commented. But basically, you're going to have to use her with battleships because the way that triggers at the 15-second mark is going to be 4 battleships, and then it's also going to only deal more damage from firepower-based attacks. It's kind of interesting, though. It seems weird because as a destroyer, her majority damage is coming from torpedo damage and as her special aviation damage. So she is buffing firepower, but that is the damage mode that she deals the least amount of damage in. Of course, you're going to be using her when you're buffing, your backline battleships, but it is kind of funny that is literally the worst stat for damage that she could have that she buffs. All right, moving on to skill number 3. She gets a plus 30% evasion stat boost. That is a lot right there, and that's going to really help with her EHP. If her third slot is equipped with a seaplane, which will almost always happen, she's going to deploy a smokescreen every odd number airstrike launched that lasts for 5 seconds, and ships within that get their standard 40% evasion rate, and it doesn't stack with other smokescreens. So she gets a smokescreen when she launches her plane, but it's only every odd number. So it happens the first time, the third time, and the seaplane's probably not fast enough to make that really relevant. The seaplane that you're equipping with her, the US one, because obviously you want the US buff, is a little bit too slow to make this super useful, but it's, I guess, some survivability, but it seems very slow. Yeah, I don't love that. Also, she heals 4% and clears any ordinary burn status for herself at every even numbered airstrike. So in between, she gets a heal and then she gets to clear burn. So that's kind of almost playing off the Shimato that we got from last season, because it has the heal and the burn reduction and the extra survivability, this time in terms of evasion rate instead of damage reduction. But it happens once again every other. So, every air launch, she's going to get something very good, right? We like the smokescreen, we like the heal, we like the burn, but it is slow between those launches. Then obviously, if you need like 2 heals, you're going to need to go for 2 and 4. Obviously, better to have the heal on the second launch, the even numbers, than the odd ones. So honestly, I'm kind of talking myself into liking this for very long battles, but it's a little bit slow likely in practice. Also, if she doesn't equip the seaplane, which probably will never happen, she gets a boost to her anti-air and torpedo stat by 15%. She takes 12% less damage, and then she procs a barrage every 15 seconds. This is all nice, but you probably will never do that. Her whole big MO is to get the plane. Like, that's where her aviation stat buff is. That's where her, all of her evasion rates and all of that. You're going to put a seaplane on her. So they might as well have not put that sentence there. But I guess if you are somebody who wants to use her in every form of content ever, you could have some flexibility there, but you won't. Halford is interesting. I really like her unique kit, and that's something I like when they do it for PR ships that are not going to slot into a top tier meta slot upon release, and they are still going to take a considerable amount of effort to obtain. So I do like her. I think she's useful. I think that aviation is going to be very useful for specific hard mode requirements, especially for newer players, not so much for us older players that have, 90+% collections, but she is interesting to me, and I think you should definitely pick her up. And with that, we're going to move on to the last ship, the Free France light cruiser Bayard. At first glance, she reminds me of another PR ship from a while ago, Neptune from PR1, but she is basically buffed in stats across the board by just a little bit, so a little bit stronger than Neptune in terms of stats. Notably though, she gets a main gun +1 and keeps her torpedoes, so in practice she's going to be a lot better than Neptune. But in terms of stats, I just wanted to kind of give you a baseline of where she's kind of sitting. She does have a lot of tankiness. Her tankiness is up there with Shimato and whatever in terms of the HP and all of that sort of things. But light cruisers notoriously live and die by their stats more than almost any other ship too. But in terms of stats, she's going to be in good shape here. She has good company. Skill number 1, she takes 15% less damage from torpedo-based damage. We always like damage reduction. When it's torpedoes, that's all right too, especially if we're going to put her at the front of the Vanguard so she can kind of soak those up. She does have a nice HP pool to do that, and she is light armor, so in terms of soaking up those torpedoes, she's going to be pretty decent at that. Also, she enters the nightly Paragon status for 5 seconds every 10 seconds. So this is up half of the time, which is interesting. She gets plus 20% speed, which is really unique for something like this, which is great. She's a French ship, and they're really about speed over in France, apparently. But then she also gets 20% evasion and 15% evasion rate. She also fires a special barrage that is kind of all over the place. It's kind of crazy. It makes the screen just look like fireworks everywhere. But it's interesting here. This nightly status is really good. The speed, the evasion rate, it kind of is a little bummer that it's only up for half of the time, but it should be up at the beginning of the battle, and then it, should be up quite often, half the time. So that's going to make her really tanky on top of the things that I already do, especially against torps. Like, she's built to just dodge torps, whether with speed, with evasion rate, the damage reduction, the light armor, the high HP pool. She is meant to be anti-torps with this skill. Skill number 2, she's going to get a 15% boost to her firepower and reload stat, and then she's going to deal more damage as her HP lowers, maxing out at 15% extra damage. This is going to really just help out with her DPS, and so we do like that. Also, when her HP is lower than 50%, she goes invincible for 5 seconds. Technically, she evades everything for 5 seconds, so crash damage is applicable, but generally she's going to dodge everything. And then she reduces all enemies currently on the field hit stat by 15% that lasts for the whole battle. Ooh, that's so interesting. And then, the rest is the siren damage and the all-out assault. This ship is like trying to be PvP relevant. Oh my gosh, I could see them trying to develop her for PvP. I really want to try her for PvP because that's where she's kind of built. She has this, barrage that's going to hit a lot, and that's going to be nice for taking out Laffy too, because it's going to get a lot of hits that are going to get under that like max damage cap. She also has the ability to go invincible. She has the ability to reduce the whole board's hit stat. So that's going to make like everybody more dodgy. Now this happens close to when she dies, but you're going to probably want to put her in the front so she can soak up all that torpedo damage. She can give a bunch of evasion rate. I wish that she had more of a smoke screen to defend the whole Vanguard fleet. There's just a little bit more that I want from this ship in PvP, because like I said, I want her to like protect the whole thing with a smoke screen, kind of like Napoli or Anchorage. And I think that I'd rather that the hit stat reduction happens a little bit earlier than her going that low. There's a lot of things that I wish she could have, but she does have a main gun +1. She has evasion rate buffs. She has so many things. She feels like she's built for it, and I feel like she's just short of being there. I think if you're a newer player and you're kind of not going for Admiral of the Navy, you could totally run her totally fine. It'd be interesting, and I do want to play around with her, especially like Alsace and things like that. This ship is like going after my heart, but I don't think it's going to get there. It's definitely interesting. Outside of PvP, I think she becomes a lot less useful. I think like her kit is definitely built for PvP. I think the hit stat is very interesting, especially against like certain enemies, but I don't think, I think you're just going to want to focus on like DPS and higher level stats when you're focusing in PvE. And like I said, I don't think she quite gets over the hump. She's so close though. Like if this ship came out before Anchorage, oh my gosh, it'd be so good. But I don't even think we would swap out Anchorage for this. I don't know. It's interesting. She can't use the Manju item, which is something that you would kind of want to use for her, especially since like she gets her procs not when she dies, but when she has low HP. So close. All right. So that is all the ships. My overall theme here is I'm actually very excited. I kind of like it. I like the Admiral Nakhimov is really interesting. I think they probably went a little bit overboard with some of her stats. I think she's like super powerful, but we'll see. She is going to be locked to having to find, Russian slows, but that shouldn't be too bad. Napoli was probably the most disappointing of the day because I don't know. I'm still excited. She's still going to be probably the tankiest ship in the game, at least in the Vanguard. And so that warrants something, but I'm like struggling to find when I'd want to use her for best in slot things. I think Daisen is kind of just a forgettable ship, but Halford is interesting. She's got a unique kit. I think that Bayard is also interesting with the unique kit. That might be my personal bias. I think the equipment is spot on. The planes are amazing. We, get all the planes. I think the most disappointing equipment was obviously the Daisen gun, because I was hoping Musashi would get something that would change the way they did, but I don't don't know if that gun's going to see any play at all because it's like sitting in the middle of no man's land there, not doing anything special. Yeah, so I think there was some good wins here. I think there were some disappointments. I was very excited about this. Obviously, I don't have any of the ships yet because it's less than a week since it releases. There will be changes as they come. Obviously, we're going to get new URs throughout the year. Most people probably won't get their DR completely done until after the Japanese anniversary. So yeah, there's a lot of time to do this. Take your pacing, but it's very interesting. I do think there's a lot of things that can change here. I don't think the PvP meta will be changed a lot, but I do think there is some bossing metas that will be changed specifically by Admiral Nakhimov. I think we need to talk about using Soyuz and Nakhimov together and figuring out if we want to use Hakuryu with them, or if we want to use Chkalov with them, or if we want to use Shinano with them, and then having to figure out who you're going to run in the Vanguard. Like, are you going to run, what ships are you going to run to meet the Shinano requirements for IJN? And I think there's a lot of things going on there. And of course, we're going to get more URs throughout before the end of the year, 2 more URs at least before the end of the year, if not more. So I think PR7 is very exciting. I enjoyed it more than probably the last PR season, I think. And anyway, let me know down in the comments what you think about this. I'm excited. Good luck on your grinds, guys. I'll see you guys next time.